There's a question that tends to arrive quietly after retirement, after the kids are grown, after the title on your business card no longer applies. It usually shows up first thing in the morning before you've even gotten out of bed. What exactly is today for? For years, that question answered itself. A job to get to, children to raise, a role that told you, without needing to think about it, what mattered today. And when that role quietly steps aside, a lot of people assume purpose steps aside with it. Here's what the research actually says: it doesn't. We tend to think of purpose as something tied to a job title, or a role, or a specific mission with a beginning and an end. Build the career, raise the family. Then, purpose presumably has been used up. But that was never quite what purpose meant to the people who studied it most closely. And once you understand what they actually found, what is today for stops being a frightening question. It becomes, quite genuinely, one of the more interesting questions you'll get to answer in your entire life. In the 1940s, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl spent years in Nazi concentration camps, in conditions almost impossible to fully describe. Everything he had, his home, his career, most of his family, was taken from him. And in that environment, stripped of every role a person typically builds an identity around, he made an observation that would shape the rest of his life's work. The prisoners who tended to survive, psychologically as well as physically, weren't necessarily the strongest or the healthiest. They were, more often, the ones who still had some reason to get through the day, even a small one. Frankl later wrote about this in a way that became the foundation of an entire field of psychology. That meaning isn't something handed to you by a role or a title. It's something you actively locate again and again in whatever circumstances you're actually in. Not the circumstances you used to have, the ones in front of you right now. Here's where most people get stuck, and it's an easy mistake to make. For most of adulthood, purpose and role arrive bundled together. You're a parent, so your purpose is raising your children. You're an engineer, or a teacher, or a shop owner, so your purpose is the work. It's convenient. The role does the thinking for you. You never had to sit down and separately ask, what actually matters to me, because the role answered it by default. But Frankl's research points to something important. The role was never the actual source of the meaning. It was simply the container the meaning happened to arrive in. When the container goes away, retirement, an empty house, children grown, the meaning doesn't automatically go with it. It just no longer has a container to sit in. That's a very different problem than, I've lost my purpose. It's closer to, I need a new container. A man named Harold spent 40 years running a small hardware store. When he finally sold it and retired, his first few months were, in his words, aimless. He'd wake up and genuinely not know what the day was for. Then, almost by accident, a neighbor mentioned her fence was falling apart, and she couldn't afford to have it fixed properly. Harold, who'd spent decades around tools and hardware, offered to help. It took him a weekend. That one small fence turned into a habit. Then, a small, informal thing in the neighborhood. Harold became the person people quietly asked when something needed fixing, and they couldn't afford to call someone. He never called it a purpose. He just called it something to do on Tuesdays. But when I asked him what his days felt like now, compared to those first aimless months, he said something worth repeating. Back then, I had all the time in the world and nothing to do with it. Now, I have less time, and every bit of it feels like it's going somewhere. That's Frankl's whole idea, in one small fence. Here's a common misunderstanding worth clearing up directly. Purpose, especially later in life, does not need to look like a second career, or a grand new mission, or anything that would fit on a resume. Frankl's research points to 3 fairly ordinary sources of meaning, and none of them require reinventing your entire identity. Meaning through creating something, even something small. Meaning through connecting with someone, even briefly. And meaning through how you choose to face something difficult, which turns out to matter just as much as the other 2. Harold's fence wasn't a mission, it was a Tuesday. But it met all 3. He created something. He connected with a neighbor. And it gave shape to a day that, without it, had none. Purpose, in other words, is rarely one big thing. It's usually several small, repeatable things, done on purpose, instead of by accident. So here's the practical shift worth making, and it's smaller than it sounds. You don't need to reinvent your life. That's an intimidating, often paralyzing task. And it's not actually what Frankl's research points toward. What you need is to reinvent your day, deliberately placing one or two small, meaningful things into it, on purpose, instead of waiting for a role to hand you a reason. That might be genuinely small, a regular phone call to someone who'd value hearing from you, a skill you already have, offered to someone who needs it, the way Harold offered his, something you make with your hands, something you tend to, literally or otherwise. None of it needs a title. It simply needs to be chosen, on purpose, rather than absent by default. So, if that question has been visiting you lately, what is today actually for? Here's the more accurate way to hold it, according to decades of research on exactly this question. It was never a question about whether you still have purpose. Frankl's work suggests you very much do. It's simply a question about which small container you're going to choose to put it in today. The role may have ended. The meaning didn't end with it. It's still there, waiting for you to hand it a Tuesday, an offense, and a reason. I'd like to know, what's your version of Harold's fence? What's one small, ordinary thing that quietly gives your day meaning? Tell me in the comments.